"You're being too sensitive. That never happened. No one else has a problem with this." These familiar phrases signal gaslighting, a sophisticated psychological warfare tactic used by emotional manipulators to control their victims. According to research, victims of long-term psychological manipulation often exhibit symptoms identical to PTSD, including hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and intrusive flashbacks. After years researching these manipulation techniques, I've discovered powerful countermeasures that create a remarkable transformation. By understanding these patterns and implementing specific strategies, you can shift from being a potential target into someone manipulators instinctively avoid. The psychological dynamics at play reveal surprising vulnerabilities in their approach. The hidden battlefield of everyday life. Have you ever felt something was wrong in a relationship but couldn't quite put your finger on it? That confusion is exactly what manipulators count on. That uneasy feeling in your stomach, the constant second-guessing of your perceptions, the subtle sense that something isn't right even when you can't identify what. These are your psychological immune system trying to protect you. But most of us have been taught to ignore these warning signals, to rationalize them away, or worse, to believe we're being paranoid or overly sensitive. Consider Sarah, who started a new job excited about the opportunities ahead. Her manager would compliment her work one day, then criticize the same work the next. When she'd mention the inconsistency, he'd deny his previous praise, making her question her memory. That knot in her stomach whenever he approached her desk was her internal alarm system activating, though she initially dismissed it as workplace anxiety. Psychological manipulation exists all around us, woven into the fabric of our daily interactions. It happens in our homes, workplaces, friend circles, and casual encounters. What makes it particularly dangerous is how rarely people recognize it until significant psychological damage has already occurred. By the time most victims realize they're being manipulated, their sense of reality has been so distorted that they struggle to trust their own perceptions. Manipulators operate like psychological predators, carefully selecting their targets and deploying sophisticated techniques that remain invisible to the untrained eye. They present themselves as friends, partners, colleagues, or mentors, while systematically undermining your psychological foundations. The most skilled manipulators can make you feel grateful for the very behaviors that are destroying your mental health. Recent psychology research reveals that manipulators engage in a methodical assessment process, using probing questions designed to identify your specific vulnerabilities. They pay careful attention to how you respond to different conversational topics, noting which areas make you defensive, insecure, or eager to prove yourself. They observe your reaction patterns, your tendency toward people-pleasing, and your boundaries. This information gathering happens in ordinary conversations that seem innocuous but serve as reconnaissance for future exploitation. Manipulation begins subtly. A new partner expresses concern about your close friendship with someone. Your boss makes a casual comment about your work ethic that doesn't feel right. A friend repeatedly makes jokes about your appearance that leave you feeling uncomfortable. These small moments establish a pattern that gradually escalates over time. This progression follows a predictable pattern. Occasional criticism evolves into persistent fault-finding. Small requests for behavioral changes grow into demands that you alter fundamental aspects of your identity. Subtle reality distortions develop into complete gaslighting campaigns. The progression is so incremental that most victims don't recognize they've crossed into damaging territory until they're deeply entrenched in the relationship. With each successful manipulation, the manipulator gains increasing control, while their target experiences diminishing autonomy. Your decision-making becomes progressively influenced by the manipulator's potential disapproval. You begin to evaluate choices through the lens of how will they respond, rather than what do I actually want. This shift happens so gradually that many mistake it for love or dedication, rather than recognizing it as the loss of personal agency. Prolonged exposure to manipulation actually alters neural pathways related to decision-making and reality perception. Your brain adapts to the constant invalidation by developing doubt as the default response to your own perceptions. This neurological rewiring explains why victims often struggle to trust themselves even years after leaving manipulative relationships. Manipulators target people with specific traits that can be exploited. They seek out individuals with high empathy, strong emotional intelligence, and the ability to see multiple perspectives, positive traits that manipulators use to induce self-doubt. People pleasers make attractive targets because their need for external validation creates exploitable pressure points. If your worth depends on others' approval, you'll tolerate increasingly harmful behavior to avoid rejection. Manipulators recognize this vulnerability within minutes, noting how quickly you accommodate others' needs and how uncomfortable you become with conflict. Previous trauma creates another significant vulnerability. Those who experience childhood invalidation or inconsistent parenting have often developed unconscious comfort with manipulation patterns. Their nervous systems were trained to interpret manipulation as normal. Manipulators detect these trauma histories by watching for inconsistent boundaries, hypervigilance, and excessive apologizing. The combination of high empathy and unhealed trauma creates the perfect target profile. Your empathy makes you invested in understanding the manipulator's perspective, while your trauma history prevents you from recognizing when that empathy is being weaponized against you. Corporate environments create unique opportunities for manipulation due to their power structures and financial dependencies. Workplace manipulators use techniques specifically adapted to professional contexts, including strategic information withholding, credit stealing, and subtle reputation sabotage. Understanding that manipulation is a systematic process transforms your ability to protect yourself. You can identify warning signs in early interactions rather than after significant damage has occurred. You begin to notice boundary tests, probing questions about past relationships, and quick escalation of intimacy that often signal manipulation campaigns. This awareness doesn't mean becoming paranoid. Most people aren't trying to manipulate you. However, developing the ability to recognize manipulation patterns allows you to distinguish between normal human imperfection and systematic psychological warfare. The first step toward protection is acknowledging that manipulation exists and understanding how it operates. Simply naming the tactics when you encounter them removes much of their power. When you can identify gaslighting or intermittent reinforcement, you create cognitive distance from the manipulation attempt, preserving your reality anchor and preventing the neurological rewiring that makes long-term manipulation possible. In the following sections, we'll examine specific manipulation techniques in detail, including early warning signs, psychological mechanics, and concrete countermeasures that protect your mental sovereignty. The insidious art of gaslighting. That never happened. You're imagining things. Words that seem innocuous but actually represent one of the most destructive forms of psychological manipulation. These simple phrases are often the first sign you're experiencing gaslighting. A technique so effective it can make you question your own sanity. I spoke with a woman last month who spent 3 years believing she had early onset dementia because her partner convinced her she was constantly forgetting conversations and events that actually never occurred. She described waking up each morning with a sense of dread, wondering what memories she would lose that day, feeling her identity slowly dissolving as she began to distrust her own mind. When she finally discovered old text messages proving her memories were accurate, her world collapsed. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right all along. Gaslighting is a sophisticated form of manipulation where the perpetrator deliberately makes you question your reality, memory, and perceptions. The term originates from a 1944 film called Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into believing she's going insane by secretly dimming their gas-powered lights while insisting the lighting remains unchanged. This psychological tactic has evolved far beyond its fictional origins, becoming one of the most common, yet least recognized forms of emotional abuse in relationships today. What makes gaslighting particularly dangerous is how it systematically dismantles your trust in yourself. Most forms of manipulation target specific behaviors or decisions, but gaslighting attacks the foundation of your psychological autonomy, your ability to perceive reality accurately. When someone consistently contradicts your experiences, memories, and perceptions, you gradually lose confidence in your most basic cognitive functions. This erosion creates dependency on the gaslighter as the arbiter of truth. You begin turning to them to validate what happened, what was said, and what is real, giving them unprecedented control over your psychological landscape. Gaslighters employ specific tactics that follow predictable patterns. Like a magician using misdirection, they first establish blatant lying, confidently stating falsehoods as obvious truths. When you present contradicting evidence, they simply deny it exists or claim it's been manipulated. A clinical psychologist I interviewed described patients whose partners deleted text messages from their phones and then claimed the conversations never happened, creating profound reality confusion. Gaslighters also systematically deny promises or commitments. They'll clearly agree to something, then later insist no such agreement existed. When you express certainty about a conversation, they respond with, "You always misunderstand everything," or, "I never said that, you're twisting my words again." This pattern trains you to doubt your memory and comprehension. Perhaps most insidiously, gaslighters use what you love against you. They target your insecurities, values, and identity as weapons. If you pride yourself on being fair, they'll accuse you of unfairness until you frantically try to prove otherwise. If you worry about being too emotional, they'll label every reaction as overreacting. One victim described how her partner knew she worried about being a good mother, so whenever she disagreed with him, he would say, "This is why you're failing our children." This targeted attack on her core identity proved more devastating than physical abuse she had experienced in previous relationships. The progressive nature of gaslighting makes it effective. It begins with small contradictions that seem insignificant. Perhaps they claim you agreed to meet at 7 when you're certain you said 8. These minor incidents establish a pattern that gradually escalates. By the time the gaslighting becomes obvious to others, you've already lost confidence in your ability to identify it. The psychological impact manifests in predictable symptoms. Chronic confusion becomes your default state. Simple decisions become overwhelming because you no longer trust your judgment. You apologize constantly, even for things objectively not your fault. Most common is the persistent feeling that something is wrong with your perception, thinking, "Maybe I am too sensitive," or "I must be misremembering again." This self-doubt becomes so ingrained that it persists even when presented with clear evidence supporting your original perceptions. Workplace gaslighting exploits professional power dynamics, often targeting women and marginalized groups. When women report sexual harassment, they're told they misinterpreted friendly behavior. When people of color identify racist comments, they hear you're being too sensitive. The phrase, "That's just how things work here," uses organizational culture to normalize problematic behaviors, making targets question their professional judgment rather than recognizing legitimate concerns. The long-term effects mirror PTSD symptoms, with victims experiencing psychological aftereffects years after leaving the relationship. Hypervigilance becomes persistent, constantly scanning for inconsistencies in all relationships. Many develop emotional numbness as protection against the pain of having their perceptions invalidated. Most troubling is the development of intrusive memories, where victims suddenly question whether entire events actually occurred as they remember, even years later. Early warning signs include persistent contradictions between what you experience and what someone tells you you experienced, creating that specific feeling of entering conversations certain about what happened and leaving confused and uncertain. Another indicator is feeling clear-headed with most people, but consistently foggy after interacting with the potential gaslighter. Perhaps the most telling warning sign is the sense that you need to record conversations to prove they happened. When you find yourself saving messages as evidence, your intuition is detecting contradictions between what you know happened and what the other person later claims. Recognizing these signs early allows you to maintain your reality anchor. Document your experiences in a secure location and consult trusted third parties who can confirm your perceptions. The most powerful defense is understanding that disagreement about events doesn't automatically invalidate your perception. Two people can experience the same situation differently without either being wrong. Your perceptions belong to you, and no one has the authority to invalidate your lived experience. Love bombing, when affection becomes a weapon. The whirlwind romance that feels too good to be true often is. Welcome to the manipulative tactic known as love bombing. I worked with a client last year who described her experience. He told me I was his soulmate on our second date. By week 3, he'd introduced me to his family and started talking about our wedding. I felt special in a way I never had before. When it all suddenly stopped, I felt like I was going through drug withdrawal. This pattern, intense, overwhelming affection followed by sudden withdrawal, represents one of the most effective manipulation tactics precisely because it feels so good at the beginning. Love bombing is an overwhelming display of affection, attention, and adoration designed to create intense emotional attachment and dependency. Unlike normal relationship development, where connection builds gradually, love bombing accelerates the attachment process artificially. The manipulator showers you with constant text messages, extravagant gifts, excessive compliments, and declarations of intense feelings disproportionate to your actual time together. They position themselves as your perfect partner, reflecting back exactly what you've revealed you want. The neurochemical fireworks display. This technique works at both psychological and neurochemical levels. The brain responds to intense positive attention by releasing dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, creating a neurochemical fireworks display that dazzles intensely but fades quickly. Like fireworks that light up the entire sky before leaving you in darkness, love bombing creates an unsustainable emotional high. These brain chemicals activate your reward pathways, creating a biological dependency on the emotional high the love bomber provides. Victims accurately describe it as an addiction rather than merely an emotional connection. The technique exploits our fundamental need for attachment and validation. Humans need to feel seen, valued, and understood. The love bomber provides an intensity of validation that feels like the ultimate fulfillment of this deep longing, making you feel uniquely appreciated in ways previous relationships never achieved. The accelerated timeline. Love bombers move relationships forward at an unnatural speed. They declare love within days, discuss marriage far earlier than appropriate, and want to spend every available moment with you. They introduce you to important people immediately, creating the illusion of serious integration into their life. This accelerated timeline serves a strategic purpose. It prevents objective evaluation. Normal-paced relationships give you time to notice inconsistencies and red flags. Love bombing prevents this by creating such an intense emotional experience that critical thinking becomes nearly impossible. As one victim explained, it's like falling in love while drunk. Everything feels amazing, but you've lost your ability to see clearly. The inevitable withdrawal. The neurochemical response creates genuine addiction. Your brain releases dopamine with each interaction and eventually restructures neural pathways to depend on this stimulation. Like any addiction, tolerance develops. You need increasing validation to feel the same high. This manufactured emotional high sets up the devastating withdrawal phase. After establishing intense connection, the love bomber abruptly changes behavior. Constant communication becomes sporadic. Flowing compliments turn to criticism. The person who couldn't spend enough time with you is suddenly distant. This transition often happens overnight, creating psychological whiplash that leaves victims disoriented and desperate to restore the connection. When withdrawal begins, victims typically blame themselves, assuming they've done something wrong. They become frantic, trying to recapture the initial dynamic by being more accommodating and willing to overlook problems. This response creates a power imbalance where victims tolerate increasingly poor treatment, hoping to regain the love bombing phase. The strategic purpose. Love bombing is particularly common among narcissists and those with manipulative personality traits. For the narcissist, it serves multiple purposes, feeding their need for adoration while establishing emotional dependency they need for control. It allows them to maintain their self-image as someone capable of intense connection, though the feelings expressed are typically shallow and strategic. The withdrawal isn't a natural relationship evolution, it's a calculated strategic move. Once they've created dependency, manipulators shift to intermittent reinforcement to increase your desperation for approval. By making validation unpredictable, they strengthen the addiction. This unpredictability makes you work harder for attention and accept worse treatment. The withdrawal phase establishes the power dynamic that will define the relationship. By demonstrating they can give or withhold affection at will, the love bomber controls the emotional temperature. This power imbalance provides the foundation for future manipulation. Protecting yourself. Understanding this pattern helps you recognize when seemingly romantic behavior is actually manipulation. The key distinction between genuine attraction and love bombing lies in pacing and proportionality. Healthy relationships develop gradually, with expressions matching the actual time spent together. Love bombing feels disproportionate. Devotion exceeds what's appropriate for how well you know each other. Watch for relationships moving at uncomfortable speed. Be wary when someone decides you're perfect before discovering your complexities. Be cautious if they're pushing for serious commitment within the first few weeks or months. Trust your sense of discomfort with excessive adoration. Many victims report feeling subtle unease even during the intoxicating phase. A quiet voice wondering, "Is this too good to be true?" This intuitive discomfort represents your psychological immune system detecting the manipulation beneath the flattering surface. Learning to heed these internal warnings, even when contradicted by positive attention, is your strongest defense against this seductive form of manipulation. The addiction of intermittent reinforcement. Why do smart, capable people stay in relationships that clearly hurt them? The answer lies in one of psychology's most powerful behavior modification techniques. I remember talking with a client, a successful attorney who managed complex litigation cases worth millions of dollars. Yet in her personal life, she kept returning to a partner who alternated between treating her like a queen and acting as if she barely existed. "I know this relationship is destroying me," she told me, "but the good moments feel so incredible that I keep convincing myself they'll become permanent if I just figure out the right thing to do." Intermittent reinforcement occurs when rewards, like affection, approval, or kindness, are given unpredictably and inconsistently, creating a powerful psychological dependency. Unlike consistent patterns where you can predict when rewards will come, intermittent reinforcement follows no discernible schedule. Sometimes the reward appears after the first attempt, sometimes after the 20th, and sometimes not at all. This unpredictability creates a uniquely powerful form of conditioning that keeps people engaged in behaviors long after they've stopped being beneficial. B.F. Skinner's experiments in the 1950s revealed that animals pressed levers more persistently when rewards came unpredictably than when rewards came consistently. This principle explains why gambling is so addictive. Casino slot machines deliver rewards randomly, creating compulsive behavior where players continue feeding money into machines despite guaranteed long-term losses. I worked with another client, a successful entrepreneur who built a 7-figure business. Despite her professional acumen, she remained trapped in a 3-year relationship cycle of passionate reunions, followed by devastating disappearances. When things are good, they're incredible, she explained. He'll plan elaborate dates, remember tiny details about my preferences, and make me feel absolutely cherished. Then suddenly, he'll vanish for days, ignore my messages, or become coldly critical. Each time I convince myself the good version is the real one, and the rest is just temporary stress. The unpredictable nature of rewards creates an addiction, where the brain becomes fixated on the possibility of reward rather than its actual frequency. Your neural pathways begin responding not to the reward itself, but to the anticipation of potential reward. This anticipation triggers dopamine release, creating pleasure from the mere possibility of receiving validation, even when that validation rarely materializes. In relationships, manipulators alternate between warmth and coldness, praise and criticism, attention and neglect, without any predictable pattern. Most confusingly, the same behavior from you can produce completely different responses at different times. A joke that made them laugh yesterday might trigger anger today. The gift they loved last month is dismissed as thoughtless now. This inconsistency prevents you from developing any reliable understanding of how to maintain connection, keeping you in a constant state of uncertainty. Many victims describe the relationship as feeling like walking through a minefield that constantly changes its configuration. This unpredictability creates hypervigilance, where you become obsessed with trying to figure out what you did wrong when the reward is withheld. You analyze conversations repeatedly, looking for the mistake that caused the withdrawal of affection. This hypervigilance consumes enormous psychological resources. Many victims report inability to focus on work, hobbies, or other relationships because their mental energy is completely absorbed by trying to decode the manipulator's inconsistent patterns. Your brain treats this as a survival-level problem, redirecting cognitive resources from other areas of your life. Over time, victims develop a distorted understanding of love and connection. The dramatic contrast between highs and lows creates an intensity that normal, healthy relationships can't match. The rare moments of validation feel extraordinarily powerful, precisely because they're so unpredictable. Research published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology found that emotional bonds formed through intermittent reinforcement took significantly longer to break than those formed through consistent, positive interaction. This explains why many victims return multiple times before finally breaking free. Each return typically begins with a period of consistent positive attention, the honeymoon phase, which then gradually transitions back to the unpredictable pattern. Neuroimaging studies show that the experience activates the same reward pathways in the brain as gambling addiction. When you receive unpredictable validation after periods of withdrawal, your brain releases a flood of dopamine that creates a more intense pleasure response than consistent positive attention would generate. This explains why logical arguments rarely persuade someone to leave. They're not dealing with a rational choice, but with brain chemistry, addiction that distorts perception. A former client described her experience. "I knew intellectually the relationship was harmful. Everyone could see it. But I felt physically sick when we were apart, anxious, depressed, unable to concentrate. When he'd finally contact me after days of silence, the relief was like nothing I'd ever experienced. I'd instantly forget all my plans to end things." Recognizing this pattern allows you to see that the problem isn't your behavior, but rather a deliberate manipulation technique designed to keep you psychologically trapped. Once you understand that the inconsistency itself is the mechanism of control, you can stop the exhausting process of trying to find the perfect behavior that will make the positive treatment consistent. Breaking free from intermittent reinforcement requires understanding it as an addiction rather than just a relationship problem. Like recovering from any addiction, the process involves withdrawal, neural pathway restructuring, and learning to find satisfaction in healthier patterns of interaction. The good news is that once you recognize this pattern for what it is, you can begin the process of reclaiming your psychological vulnerability factors. Why some people become targets. Ever wondered why some people seem to repeatedly find themselves in manipulative relationships while others rarely experience them? I've noticed this pattern consistently in my practice. Certain individuals encounter manipulation across multiple relationships and contexts, while others appear relatively immune. This difference isn't random or simply bad luck. It reflects specific psychological factors that create vulnerability to manipulation techniques. I remember working with a client who had survived 3 consecutive relationships with manipulative partners. She was brilliant, accomplished, and psychologically insightful about others, yet somehow blind to the manipulation patterns that kept appearing in her personal life. "Why do I keep attracting these people?" she asked me. "It's like they have some kind of radar that identifies me as a potential target." Her intuition was accurate. Manipulators do possess a psychological radar that detects specific vulnerability signals, much like how specialized equipment can detect hairline fractures invisible to the naked eye. Certain psychological and emotional characteristics make individuals more susceptible to manipulation, creating patterns that repeat across different relationships. These vulnerability factors create openings that skilled manipulators identify and exploit. Understanding your specific vulnerability profile empowers you to strengthen these psychological weak points and break recurring patterns. These vulnerability factors represent positive human traits that manipulators exploit precisely because they're valuable characteristics. Others stem from childhood experiences that shaped your understanding of love, trust, and relationship dynamics before you had any conscious choice in the matter. These early experiences create unconscious templates for relationships that persist into adulthood unless deliberately examined. People who experienced inconsistent parenting or childhood emotional neglect develop an unconscious comfort with intermittent reinforcement patterns. When early caregivers were unpredictably available, sometimes attentive, other times distant, your developing brain adapted to this inconsistency as normal. Your neural pathways formed around the expectation that love comes with unpredictability and must be earned. This conditioning creates familiarity with manipulative relationship patterns that use intermittent reinforcement as control. I worked with a woman whose mother showed affection only when she performed perfectly in school. This conditional love trained her brain to associate uncertainty and performance with love. As an adult, she found herself drawn to partners who withheld affection unpredictably, recreating the neurological patterns established in childhood. The manipulation felt familiar rather than obviously wrong. High empathy and people-pleasing tendencies make ideal targets for manipulators. These positive traits, seeing others' perspectives, attunement to emotional needs, willingness to accommodate, become vulnerabilities when exploited. Your capacity to imagine others' feelings makes you inclined to give second chances and find explanations for concerning behavior. Your desire for harmony can make you reluctant to establish firm boundaries. Manipulators look for people who prioritize others' needs above their own. They identify potential targets by watching responses to small impositions. Do you automatically say yes to favors? Apologize when someone bumps into you? Struggle with direct disagreement? These behaviors signal you'll likely tolerate increasingly inappropriate behavior rather than risk conflict. Unprocessed trauma creates specific psychological vulnerabilities that manipulators can leverage. Trauma disrupts your sense of safety, alters threat assessment, and creates emotional triggers that manipulators can activate to control your responses. Your nervous system establishes heightened reactivity to certain situations, and manipulators learn these triggers to create emotional flooding that prevents clear thinking. Sexual abuse survivors often develop vulnerabilities around physical boundaries. Childhood emotional abuse creates sensitivity to criticism. Witnessing domestic violence can normalize conflict patterns that would otherwise trigger warning signals. These trauma histories create specific openings that skilled manipulators recognize if you haven't processed these wounds. A history of invalidation teaches potential victims to doubt their perceptions and emotions. When you've repeatedly heard, you're too sensitive, or you're overreacting, you develop a habit of questioning your reality. This learned self-doubt creates the foundation for gaslighting. The manipulator continues the invalidation pattern you've already internalized, leveraging your existing habit of second-guessing yourself. This explains why intelligent, otherwise confident people become victims of obvious manipulation. Their critical thinking works against them when applied to their own perceptions. They've been trained to question their emotional responses rather than trust them as valuable information. This disregard for internal warning signals prevents recognition of manipulation until the pattern is established. Social isolation significantly increases vulnerability to manipulation. When you lack connections to others who provide reality checks, you become more dependent on the manipulator's version of reality. This explains why manipulators typically isolate their targets from friends and family who might recognize the manipulation. Periods of transition create temporary vulnerability even for those who might otherwise recognize manipulation. Major life changes like divorce, job loss, or health crises disrupt your normal support systems while increasing your need for connection. Manipulators look for people in these transitional states, offering intense support that later transforms into control. Understanding your vulnerability factors doesn't mean blaming yourself, but identifying patterns that need healing. Think of it like strengthening specific muscles that have been injured. By recognizing these psychological vulnerability points, you can develop targeted strategies to reinforce them against future exploitation. These vulnerability factors can be addressed through focused psychological work. You can honor your empathy while establishing firm boundaries, heal attachment wounds that normalized inconsistent love, and restore trust in your perceptions, rebuilding the internal warning system that manipulation specifically targets. Workplace manipulation, professional predators. The office politics you're navigating might actually be sophisticated psychological warfare designed to undermine your confidence and control your behavior. Last month, I spoke with a marketing director who discovered her boss had been systematically undermining her presentations to upper management. While encouraging her to develop bold new strategies to her face, he was sending private emails to the executive team warning them that her ideas were risky and impractical. When she accidentally received one of these emails, she realized the confusion and doubt she'd been feeling weren't personal failings, but the result of deliberate sabotage. Workplace manipulation adapts to professional environments, hiding behind corporate culture and professional norms. These tactics disguise themselves as normal business practices. Performance reviews become vehicles for subtle undermining. Project assignments transform into power plays. Even casual team meetings can serve as stages for manipulation that leaves victims questioning their competence while maintaining plausible deniability for the manipulator. The professional context creates perfect conditions for psychological manipulation. Hierarchical power structures make questioning manipulative behavior risky. Professional demeanor requirements limit direct confrontation. Financial dependency raises the stakes significantly. Your livelihood depends on navigating these dynamics. Let's examine the primary workplace manipulation tactics: credit theft and blame deflection. A manipulative colleague claims ownership when projects succeed but distances themselves when they fail. Case example: a team member presents your research findings as their own during an executive presentation, but when questions arise about methodology, they quickly mention it was originally your approach. This pattern establishes their reputation as innovative while positioning you as unreliable. Strategic information withholding. Manipulators deliberately keep you from accessing crucial information needed to complete your work successfully. They forget to copy you on important emails, fail to mention key deadline changes, or withhold context that would impact your approach. When you stumble due to missing information, they express disappointment about your performance, often publicly. The psychological impact intensifies when public criticism pairs with private praise. Your manager criticizes your work in team meetings but tells you privately how valuable you are. This creates confusion since the private validation makes you question whether you're overreacting to the public criticism while isolating you from colleagues who only witness the negative feedback. Workplace gaslighting has its own specialized vocabulary. "That's not what we discussed in the meeting," undermines your memory. "You misunderstood the assignment," shifts responsibility to you. "Everyone else understood the instructions," isolates you. "I never said that deadline was flexible," rewrites history. These phrases systematically erode your trust in your professional judgment and memory. Manipulative bosses frequently employ impossible standards and moving goalposts. You meet their established metrics only to discover they've changed. You complete a project to their specifications only to hear, "This isn't what I wanted." These undefined expectations make success impossible by design, ensuring you remain in a position where you're constantly trying to prove your value. The workplace manipulation experienced by marginalized groups often includes specialized gaslighting that dismisses legitimate experiences of discrimination. People of color identifying microaggressions hear, "You're being too sensitive." Women reporting harassment are told they misinterpreted friendly behavior. Disabled employees requesting accommodations are labeled difficult. This form of manipulation attacks fundamental identity and lived experience. Research suggests DARVO, deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, appears most consistently across different workplace contexts. When confronted, manipulators 1. Deny the behavior occurred despite evidence. 2. Attack your character or motives for raising the concern. 3. Position themselves as the actual victim. This technique proves particularly effective because it leverages existing power dynamics while creating significant risk for anyone who challenges it. The marketing director I mentioned earlier experienced this when she confronted her boss about the undermining emails. He denied sending them, suggested she was paranoid about job security, and complained to HR that she was creating a hostile work environment. The long-term impact of workplace manipulation extends beyond immediate distress. Victims often develop a form of professional PTSD, affecting their performance and confidence even after leaving toxic environments. They become hypervigilant about documentation, hesitant to share ideas, and reluctant to trust leadership. Recognizing these tactics allows you to implement protective strategies. Document everything in writing. Follow up verbal conversations with email summaries. Build relationships with witnesses who can confirm your experiences. Establish communication patterns that force clarity through written confirmation. Request explicit expectations at the beginning of projects. Perhaps most importantly, recognize that workplace manipulation says nothing about your professional competence and everything about the manipulator's character. The tactics deployed against you often directly correlate with the professional threat you represent. Many targets are specifically selected because their competence, creativity, or integrity poses a challenge to the manipulator's position. Understanding this dynamic allows you to maintain your professional confidence even while navigating these challenging environments. The DARVO defense, recognizing blame shifting. Have you ever confronted someone about their behavior only to end up feeling like you were the one who did something wrong? That's DARVO in action. Last week, I received a message from a viewer describing this exact situation. She confronted her partner about lying about his whereabouts, showing him text evidence that contradicted his story. Instead of acknowledging the lie, he accused her of spying on him, called her pathologically insecure, and then tearfully claimed she was destroying their relationship with her trust issues. She ended up apologizing to him, completely forgetting that the conversation began with his documented deception. DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. This term was coined by Dr. Jennifer Fried, a psychology professor who studied traumatic betrayal and its effects. She identified this consistent pattern while researching how people respond when confronted with evidence of their harmful behavior. DARVO operates as a structured technique that follows a predictable sequence designed to disarm victims and evade accountability. This technique transforms a legitimate complaint into an attack on the person who raised the concern. The emotional whiplash leaves victims questioning their own perceptions and feeling guilty for bringing up the issue. You approach someone with a valid concern about their behavior, and you walk away feeling like you've harmed them by mentioning it. This reality distortion is why Darvo works so effectively. The process begins with flat denial, regardless of available evidence. The manipulator immediately responds with, "That never happened," or "I never said that," even when presented with text messages, emails, recordings, or witnesses. The audacity of denying something with clear evidence creates disorientation. Your brain struggles to reconcile the contradiction between objective evidence and their confident denial, creating the first crack in your reality perception. What makes the denial phase effective is its absoluteness. There's no partial acknowledgement, just complete rejection of reality. I worked with a client whose partner denied making a hurtful comment, despite 6 people hearing it at a dinner party. When she mentioned that others had heard it too, he claimed they were all misremembering or conspiring against him. This comprehensive reality rejection creates profound confusion that perfectly sets up the next phase. The attack phase shifts from defense to offense, where the manipulator actively criticizes the person who raised the concern. This attack typically focuses on the victim's character, mental stability, or intentions. "You're always looking for problems. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. You're trying to control me." This strategic attack distracts from the original issue by creating a new problem. It puts you on the defensive, forcing you to defend yourself rather than addressing their behavior. Most crucially, it activates shame and self-doubt, psychological states that make clear thinking difficult. When someone questions your fundamental character, your brain's threat response activates, hampering logical thinking. Building on this foundation of denial and attack, the final phase completes the reversal by positioning the manipulator as the actual victim. They transform from offender to injured party with statements like, "I can't believe you would hurt me with such accusations. I feel so attacked. I can't trust you with my feelings. I'm always walking on eggshells around you." This victim positioning often includes tears, hurt expressions, or wounded withdrawal that trigger your empathy. This reversal represents Darvo's most psychologically powerful phase. When executed effectively, it completely inverts the situation, making you feel guilty for raising a legitimate concern. Your compassion activates, leading you to comfort the very person who harmed you. Many victims describe finding themselves apologizing to someone who clearly wronged them, completely losing sight of the original issue. This technique is especially common when confronting abusive behavior, appearing in approximately 74% of confrontations about domestic abuse. It serves multiple purposes for abusers: avoiding shame and self-reflection, reinforcing power and control, and gradually training victims to stop raising concerns altogether. Darvo exploits normal human psychology. Most people enter difficult conversations with some self-doubt and openness to different perspectives. Manipulators weaponize these positive qualities, using your openness against you to distort your reality perception. To recognize Darvo, watch for the 3-stage pattern where your legitimate concern is denied, your character is attacked, and suddenly you're apologizing to the person who harmed you. Pay attention to your emotional progression during these conversations. You typically start feeling confident and justified, become confused and defensive, and finally end up feeling guilty and apologetic. The most telling sign is the complete topic shift. The conversation begins with a specific behavior, but ends focused entirely on your character, intentions, or communication approach. If you find yourself defending your right to raise a concern rather than discussing the concern itself, Darvo is likely in progress. Recognizing this pattern allows you to maintain your reality anchor. When you can name the technique as it's happening, "This seems like Darvo," you reduce its psychological impact significantly. The technique relies on confusion and emotional flooding. Identifying the pattern as it unfolds helps maintain clarity and prevents reality distortion. The most effective defense against Darvo is refusing to engage with diversionary tactics. When someone denies documented behavior, don't debate whether it happened. When they attack your character, avoid defending yourself. When they position themselves as the victim, maintain focus on the original issue. This steady return to the actual concern prevents the conversation from being derailed. Psychological defense, building your mental fortress. What if I told you there's a psychological technique so powerful that manipulators will actively avoid you once you master it. I discovered this after working with hundreds of manipulation survivors who transformed from perpetual targets to individuals that manipulators instinctively avoid. The shift wasn't about becoming confrontational or suspicious. It was about developing an internal psychological architecture that makes manipulation attempts immediately visible and ultimately futile. Think of your mind as a fortress with defensive walls against manipulation. Just like a medieval castle requires multiple layers of protection, moats, walls, and watchtowers, your psychological defense system needs several complementary skills working together. When these defenses are properly built and maintained, manipulation attempts simply bounce off, unable to breach your mental stronghold. The foundation of this psychological fortress begins with emotional awareness, the ability to recognize and name your emotions without judgment or suppression. Manipulators rely on your emotional reactions to maintain control, deliberately triggering shame, fear, obligation, or guilt to keep you off balance. When you can identify, "This is shame arising," or "I'm feeling fear now," you create crucial space between stimulus and response, allowing you to choose your reaction rather than being driven by emotional flooding. I worked with a client who developed this awareness through daily emotion tracking. She kept a simple record of emotional states throughout her day, noting triggers and physical sensations. Within weeks, she could identify when her manipulative colleague was deliberately activating her insecurity to gain compliance. This awareness allowed her to respond thoughtfully, eliminating the emotional leverage the manipulator had previously exploited. The second layer of defense is cognitive reframing, which directly counters manipulation narratives. Instead of accepting the reality interpretation presented by the manipulator, cognitive reframing involves consciously examining alternative explanations. When someone says "you always ruin everything," reframing involves questioning, "Is this actually true? What evidence contradicts this statement? What's a more balanced perspective?" This questioning process prevents manipulators from implanting distorted beliefs that serve their control agenda. By maintaining your ability to interpret experiences independently, you preserve your cognitive autonomy, the exact psychological territory manipulators attempt to conquer. The more you practice examining evidence and considering alternative interpretations, the less vulnerable you become to manipulation. The third critical layer is reality anchoring, which provides concrete protection against gaslighting and reality distortion. Journaling conversations creates an objective record you can reference when manipulators claim, "That never happened," or "I never said that." This documentation maintains your reality anchor when facing sophisticated gaslighting attempts. Consulting trusted third parties offers another form of reality anchoring. When deeply enmeshed in manipulation, your perception becomes increasingly isolated as the manipulator establishes their reality as the only valid perspective. Checking your perceptions with emotionally healthy individuals provides crucial external validation. Hearing "yes, that does sound manipulative" from neutral sources helps reestablish trust in your own perceptions. Developing strong internal validation represents perhaps the most powerful long-term defense. When your sense of worth, reality, and truth comes primarily from within rather than requiring external confirmation, you become virtually impervious to techniques that exploit validation dependency. This internal validation develops through deliberately honoring your perceptions, needs, and emotional responses, even when they differ from others. Reality testing provides another defense technique when facing sophisticated gaslighting. This involves seeking concrete evidence to confirm or disprove your perceptions when they're being challenged. If someone claims you agreed to something you don't remember, reality testing might involve checking messages or asking neutral witnesses what they recall. The ultimate psychological defense technique that instantly disarms manipulators is the strategic use of calm, non-defensive questioning. When a manipulator makes an unfounded accusation, simply asking, "Can you help me understand what you mean by that?" or "I'm confused. You said the opposite yesterday. Can you explain?" forces them to either acknowledge the contradiction or construct an increasingly complex web of deceptions. This questioning technique works because manipulators rely on your emotional engagement. They want you defensive, confused, or emotional. states where critical thinking diminishes. When you remain calm and request clarification, you deny them the emotional leverage they need. I've witnessed countless manipulation attempts collapse under simple neutral questions that expose inconsistencies. These psychological defense techniques work silently, without confrontation. You don't need to label someone a manipulator or challenge them directly. You simply strengthen your psychological foundations in ways that make their techniques ineffective, preventing the escalation that often occurs when manipulation is directly named. These mechanisms don't just protect you from current manipulation, they actually make you a less appealing target for future manipulators who sense they can't easily control your reality. Manipulators assess potential targets quickly, looking for specific vulnerability signals. When they encounter someone with strong defenses, they typically move on to easier targets. By integrating these techniques into your daily life, you transform your internal landscape into territory that manipulators cannot successfully navigate. You maintain your compassion and openness while developing discrimination that prevents exploitation of these positive traits, allowing you to remain emotionally available to healthy connections. Communication boundaries, the language of protection. The words you choose and how you structure conversations can either invite manipulation or create a psychological shield that manipulators can't penetrate. I recently witnessed this with a client who transformed her relationship with a manipulative family member, not by changing the person, but by completely changing how she communicated. Within weeks, the manipulation attempts that had tormented her for years simply stopped. The family member didn't suddenly develop empathy or self-awareness. They simply recognized their usual tactics weren't working anymore and abandoned them. Strategic communication boundaries create a protective framework that makes manipulation attempts obvious and ineffective. Most people believe they need to explain their boundaries extensively or justify their feelings to be understood. This over-communication creates openings that manipulators exploit. They use your explanations to find weaknesses, identify emotional triggers, and gather information they can use against you later. Effective communication boundaries involve sharing less, not more, while being extremely precise with the information you do provide. These communication techniques prevent manipulators from controlling the conversation, reframing reality, or accessing your emotional vulnerabilities. They create a psychological container around your interactions that limits the manipulator's ability to deploy their usual tactics. When you communicate with strategic boundaries, manipulators can't easily redirect conversations, create confusion, or provoke emotional reactions they can exploit. What if your words could be your shield? Here are the most effective communication strategies. Assertive language using I statements expresses boundaries without creating defensive reactions. For example, saying, "I won't be available to help this weekend," instead of, "You always expect me to drop everything for you," communicates the same boundary without opening the door to arguments. This avoids accusatory tones that manipulators use to justify defensive reactions. The broken record technique involves calmly repeating your position without engaging with distractions. When a manipulator attempts to change the subject, simply return to your original statement. "I understand you have concerns about other issues, but I need an answer about whether you took money from my account." I worked with a woman whose manipulative partner had avoided discussing financial deception for months through conversation redirection. When she implemented the broken record technique, repeatedly asking, "Did you take money from our savings?" without discussing it with me, despite his attempts to discuss her trust issues, he finally addressed the issue directly. Strategic disengagement allows you to exit conversations when manipulation tactics appear. Most victims of manipulation mistakenly believe they can overcome manipulation through logical arguments or emotional appeals. The conversation itself is the manipulation. The longer you stay engaged, the more opportunities the manipulator has to confuse and control you. This doesn't mean storming off. It involves calmly stating, "I notice this conversation isn't productive right now. Let's resume when we can focus on the actual issue." Then physically removing yourself without being drawn back in by the manipulator's attempts to prolong the engagement. Gray rock communication. Being deliberately uninteresting and unreactive removes the emotional feedback manipulators need. Manipulators thrive on emotional engagement of any kind. When you communicate with minimal information, limited emotional response, and basic engagement, you deprive manipulators of the emotional energy they seek. Many clients report that after consistently implementing gray rock communication, manipulators actually leave them alone entirely, seeking more emotionally responsive targets who provide the reaction they crave. Clear, concrete language with written follow-up creates an objective record manipulators can't deny or distort. Manipulators rely on ambiguity and plausible deniability. They use vague language themselves and deliberately misinterpret your words. This approach might involve sending follow-up emails. As we discussed today, you agreed to repay the $500 by June 1st. These written confirmations prevent manipulators from claiming different agreements later and signal that you're documenting interactions, making future manipulation attempts riskier. For example, after a manipulative colleague verbally agreed to take on a project but later denied it, a client sent a simple email. "Hi Tom, confirming our conversation today where you agreed to complete the Wilson report by Friday. Let me know if you need any resources." This created accountability and dramatically reduced instances of shirked responsibility. Over time, documentation reveals patterns most manipulators work hard to keep hidden. When a manipulator claims, "I never do that," your documentation provides concrete evidence of the recurring pattern. This evidence helps maintain your own reality anchor when facing gaslighting and reality distortion. These communication boundaries protect you in the moment and signal to manipulators that their usual tactics won't work with you, often causing them to seek easier targets. Manipulators assess the cost-benefit ratio of their efforts, investing energy in targets who provide the desired response with minimal resistance. This natural selection process happens without confrontation or accusation. You don't need to label someone a manipulator or force them to acknowledge their behavior. You simply change how you communicate, creating an environment where manipulation attempts consistently fail to produce the desired outcome. When manipulation stops working, manipulators typically stop trying, not because they've changed, but because they've recognized you're no longer a viable target. Rebuilding after manipulation, the recovery process. The most devastating effect of psychological manipulation isn't what happens during the relationship. It's the lasting damage to your ability to trust yourself and others. I still remember sitting across from a client who had successfully escaped a manipulative marriage 3 years earlier. "I'm free now," she told me, "but I still hear his voice in my head questioning every decision I make. I second-guess my simplest choices. I can't trust my own judgment about people anymore. Sometimes I wonder if he's still controlling me even though he's gone." Her hands trembled as she spoke, eyes darting to the corners of the room as if searching for hidden critics of her words. Recovering from manipulation requires deliberately rebuilding your connection to your own perceptions, emotions, and intuition. This recovery rebuilds the psychological foundations that manipulation systematically destroyed. Your ability to trust your senses, believe your emotional responses are valid, make decisions confidently. These fundamental capacities were specifically targeted through manipulation. Healing requires reconstructing these internal systems rather than waiting for time to heal the wounds. This recovery process presents a unique challenge because manipulation damages the very tools needed for healing. Self-trust, reality perception, emotional clarity, boundary recognition, these are precisely what manipulation damages most severely. It's like trying to repair a shattered mirror while only able to see your reflection in its broken pieces. The psychological mechanisms you would normally use to guide healing have themselves been compromised, creating a recovery challenge that many traditional therapeutic approaches fail to address. The first stage involves validating your experiences by naming the manipulation tactics you encountered and acknowledging their impact. This naming creates crucial cognitive distance between you and the manipulation. When you can say, "That was gaslighting," or "They used intermittent reinforcement," you transform confusing experiences into recognizable patterns. This recognition helps your brain process these as external events rather than personal failings, beginning the shift from self-blame to understanding the deliberate nature of what happened. This validation stage often involves grief as you acknowledge reality. Many survivors experience waves of anger, sadness, and loss as they recognize the deliberate nature of manipulation they previously excused. A client who discovered her partner had been systematically gaslighting her described feeling like I'm mourning the person I thought he was, the relationship I thought we had, and the years I lost believing his version of reality. This grief represents necessary processing that allows for genuine recovery. Rebuilding self-trust happens through deliberately practicing small decisions and honoring your emotional responses. Most manipulation survivors have been conditioned to doubt their perceptions and emotions. Reversing this conditioning occurs through consistent small experiences of trusting yourself and finding that trust validated. Begin with simple decisions like choosing what to eat without seeking external validation, then gradually expand to larger decisions. Each time you honor your perception and find it valid, you strengthen neural pathways supporting self-trust. This rebuilding works best as deliberate practice rather than testing yourself with high-stakes situations. Create self-trust repetitions, multiple daily opportunities to practice trusting your perceptions in low-risk contexts. Notice your response to a movie without checking if others agree. Decide which route to take without second-guessing. These small moments create cumulative impact, gradually restoring your connection to your internal guidance system. Many survivors benefit from creating a reality consensus with trusted friends who provide perspective when self-doubt emerges. When manipulation has damaged your reality testing, these trusted perspectives serve as training wheels while rebuilding your perceptual confidence. You learn to distinguish between legitimate different perspectives and deliberate reality distortion, a discrimination that manipulation specifically targets. One woman created a small circle of trusted friends she consulted when facing situations that triggered doubt. They help me recognize when my doubt is manipulation residue rather than legitimate uncertainty, she explained. Over time, she needed these reality checks less frequently as her internal reality anchor strengthened, but this support during rebuilding proved crucial. Reclaiming personal power involves identifying and challenging internalized messages from manipulators. Many survivors hear the manipulator's voice questioning their decisions and predicting failure if they trust themselves. Recovery requires recognizing these thought patterns as foreign installations rather than authentic thoughts, then replacing them with healthier internal dialogue. This replacement happens through conscious redirection when manipulator-originated thoughts arise. When thinking, "I'll fail at this just like he always said," pause and ask, "Is this my assessment or his voice?" Then create an alternative thought based on evidence. "I've succeeded at similar challenges when I trusted my abilities." This restructuring weakens neural pathways carrying the manipulator's messages while strengthening authentic self-assessment. How do you rebuild self-trust after manipulation? Through deliberate practice in recognizing and validating your perceptions, emotions, and needs. Begin with basic sensory perceptions, trusting what you see and hear, rather than automatically questioning your experience. Expand to emotional validation. Recognizing your emotional responses makes sense, given your experience. Eventually, include intuitive trust, honoring your gut feelings about people and situations. This rebuilding happens through hundreds of small moments where you choose self-trust over self-doubt, self-validation over external approval seeking. Each experience strengthens the neural pathways supporting self-trust and reinforces decision-making confidence. The recovery process creates stronger psychological boundaries that protect against future manipulation. Many survivors develop enhanced ability to recognize subtle manipulation early. The painful experience, when properly processed, strengthens your psychological immune system. Your awareness of specific tactics combined with rebuilt self-trust creates protection that naive individuals lack. The ultimate outcome of successful recovery is development of unprecedented psychological strength. Many survivors eventually feel grateful for the experience because it forced them to develop self-trust beyond what they would have otherwise achieved. Your rebuilt psychological foundation establishes a level of sovereignty that makes you remarkably resistant to future control attempts. The most powerful protection against psychological manipulation isn't avoidance or suspicion. It's developing unshakable self-trust. Through our exploration of these manipulation tactics and defense strategies, you've gained the tools to transform yourself from a potential target into someone manipulators actively avoid. Your psychological sovereignty emerges from honoring your perceptions, establishing clear boundaries, and trusting your natural warning systems. No constant vigilance or isolation required. Remember that your intuition exists to protect you. When something feels wrong in a relationship, that's your psychological immune system alerting you to danger. Trust that inner voice. It knows the truth before